Hello. Today we are going to review 5 steps that you can take to reduce the cost of a workplace investigation. My name is Dorian Persaud. I am the senior lawyer at Persaud Employment Law. We are a team of lawyers who specialize in conducting workplace investigations and helping you to conduct better investigations and to build a healthy workplace through effective investigations, training, and proactive advice. Thank you to everyone joining us this afternoon, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. For those who have been with us before, you'll know that we leave quite a bit of time on the back end of these presentations for questions and answers, and I would encourage all of you to use the chat function, and there's a Q&A function within there where you can pose your questions. My colleague Melanie is on the panel with me this morning, and she will be reviewing the Q&As and posing those questions to me at the conclusion of our presentation this afternoon. So the first step that you can take when you receive a complaint and you have made the decision to conduct an investigation is to come up with an investigation plan. You know, there's a saying that if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. And that's certainly the case when it comes to investigations. If you want to keep things on track, it's very helpful to map out the process ahead of time and be able to predict what the next steps are in the investigation, the order in which events are going to happen, and be able to plan accordingly. One of the key things that you can do to keep any investigation on track is to be aware of your mandate and have that clarified very early in the process. And that's going to give you the clarity that you need to plan all of the other steps. And we will get into more details around the mandate later in this presentation. But essentially the mandate is what it is that you are being retained to do. What is the question that you are there to answer? So is the investigation centered around a specific complaint and incidents of problematic conduct, or is it something broader than that? The mandate is essentially the question that you are looking to answer as you go about this fact finding. The second element of your investigation plan involves mapping out the stages of the investigation. So at the outset, you have what I'll call the investigation setup or the information gathering stage. And at that stage, you are pulling together the complaint and relevant documents, and you are identifying other information that you might need or specialties that you might need to bring in. These days, a lot of my cases involve retrieving emails and messages that were shared in a workplace group chat, and there's different platforms where those messages can be exchanged. But identifying early on that you need the IT support to retrieve these messages, that's part of what you're mapping out here at this stage of the investigation. The other stages include the interview stage. And so once you have your mandate, you then know, here are the folks that I need to meet with in order to complete the investigation. And as we know, that might change, right? As the investigation gets underway, things evolve, and you may or may not need to meet with the folks that you identify, but it's helpful to at least identify those folks at the outset so that you can budget accordingly. And then finally, you have the analysis and the report writing stage. And that's the step where you then are able to again, for budgeting purpose, identify, well, if I've met with these many witnesses, this is the amount of information that I am likely to have collected at this point in time. And, what type of report am I looking at? Are we looking at a summary report or something more detailed? So again, those are some of the things that you don't necessarily have to decide up front, but it's helpful to at least turn your mind to that at the outset of the investigation. And that way, as you're going through the process, you can take the steps that are necessary. So for me personally, if I know that at the end of the process, the client is expecting a detailed report, that's something that we actually start writing as we go along. We summarize the evidence and start dropping that into the report. And then at the end of the interview stage, we know that at that point, it's just the analysis then that we need to do, having collected all of the evidence. If we know that a detailed report is not necessary, then again, we're setting up our systems internally so that we can produce the summary report or whatever the product is that the client is expecting. Another item that you'll want to cover in your plan is the details around working with representatives, or if you are in a unionized workplace, what are the expectations and what's the participation level of the union? So in many collective agreements, if not in the agreement itself, through practice, the employee being interviewed, whether they're a party or simply a witness to the events, they may have the right to a union rep attending. So that's something that you want to make a note of, because that may drive up your cost in terms of the investigator then having to communicate with this representative in terms of scheduling interviews. You're scheduling around the calendar of that representative and the witness in question. So it adds another dynamic there that needs to be considered. Along with that is the expectation of the parties in terms of how these interviews are going to be conducted. I recently did some work for a school board, and their preference was for me to conduct in-person interviews with the parties and witnesses involved. However, when I met with those individuals, it was very clear that the union, their expectation was that these interviews would take place via video conference. And that was something that I then had to go back to the client and discuss with them, and they were flexible. But it just gives you an example of how sometimes there might be a disconnect between what the expectations of the union are and the workers are, and the expectations of management. So it's good to identify that upfront and then be able to plan accordingly. Another thing that might come up at this stage too is how evidence is going to be recorded. In many cases, especially where I'm conducting the interview via video conference, it isn't a problem to audio record that interview and then produce a transcript and share that with the parties for them to ensure that the evidence that we recorded is complete and it's accurate and reflects their story. But there was one employer that I worked with where the union had very strong feelings around the interviews being recorded, and so that wasn't an option in that case. So we went back to the old school method of me simply typing my questions and typing my answers as we went through the interview. But again, that's another example of where the expectations of the union may change or certainly influence the way that the investigation is conducted. And that brings us to mandate. As I said before, the clearest way to get off track and rack up additional investigation costs is where there isn't clarity around the mandate, and the investigator ends up pursuing allegations that may come up, in the course of their interviews. And these might be serious allegations. They may be worthy of investigation, but they at least at the outset, fall outside of the scope of that investigator's mandate, and it becomes problematic if they are out pursuing and investigating these other details that arise instead of sticking to the task at hand. So, when it comes to mandate, again, we talked about, that is the issue that you're there to look into, and you have to decide. One of the elements of a mandate is this a fact finding? Are you there to just look into the complaint itself, and did these incidents occur? Or is this a fact finding coupled with legal advice? You want to know both what occurred, but also you want the investigator to give you recommendations in terms of how to respond to that misconduct, or what should be the consequences of any findings. So that's important to make clear at the outset of the process. Also, whether or not, again, this is going to be a narrowly the scope of the investigation is narrowly focused on the incidents in question, or if it's more of a workplace assessment and a broader assessment of misconduct or problematic behavior that, again, is going to impact the cost of the investigation. So setting the mandate provides that clarity, provides that focus, and everything else really flows from there. I had a case a few months back where an employee had come forward with allegations of harassment against a colleague, and in the course of our interviews, it came out that these incidents went back at least 2 years, and were ongoing since that time. And when I asked what steps had been taken to bring this to the attention of management, she disclosed that she hadn't brought it to the attention of management until recently, and that was because the person she reported to, the general manager, he was having an affair with the person that she was having a conflict with. So you could imagine in that circumstance, she didn't feel very comfortable coming forward and raising that issue, especially so given that dynamic, and then especially given the fact that this general manager was the most senior person in the workplace. And what would that mean if she as a complainant brought these concerns forward against someone that he was romantically linked with? How is that going to end up well for her, right? So those are valid fears, and certainly ones that we see played out. Some version of that story we're familiar with in many different contexts. So that's an example where very relevant information came to light, and what I did in that case was collect some details about what she knew about the fact that these two individuals were involved, and what evidence she had of that, and just briefly collected those details just to have enough context where I could take that information back to the client and have them decide if they wanted to make that issue part of my current mandate, or if that was something that they would like to pursue separately. So that's the way that you want to treat these things. When you have clarity about what you're there to do, you're then better able to make these other decisions as information comes forward. The third strategy that I'd like to review with you is just understanding the cost drivers. Like, what are the things that drive the cost of an investigation? And I've broken this into three major stages for you. So first is preparation. I had a sexual harassment case, and the case centered around a workplace relationship that was a consensual relationship between colleagues, but one party broke it off. The other party wasn't happy about that. And he started essentially blackmailing his ex-girlfriend at work. And he would send her messages in group chats and through email, and then go into the system and delete those messages. But essentially saying, look, if you don't get back to me, or if you don't respond to my overtures, I am going to release these images that we took together and videos that we filmed together, and he would send her little snippets of things that she thought he had deleted, but which he clearly had not. So all of that information existed on their phones, on their personal devices, but also some of that communication occurred on the company's network. So part of the preparation was working with IT to retrieve these messages, and that took quite some time. So not every case is like that. In the majority of cases, what you have is a written complaint or some version of that, and you then meet with the complainant to flesh out that complaint and collect the relevant details. But there are some investigations where you do need to put in the time on the front end. And by doing that, in that specific case, that sexual harassment case, because we put in the time and the effort to collecting those messages, I was then able to obtain other evidence from the parties themselves, and then in my examination, in my interview with the responding party, put these messages to him, which were very damning because they clearly conflicted with other information that he had shared with me during his interviews. So the work that you put in on the front end of the investigation certainly is helpful as you go through the process and helps you to make sound conclusions. But again, it's just an understanding that in some cases there will be a good chunk of time that's dedicated to that prep work. The other driver of cost is the interviews themselves. And once you have your mandate, you then have an idea of, well, here's who we need to meet with to conclude the investigation. We've got the complainant or complainants. We've got the responding parties. And then we have some witnesses that we may need to meet with to resolve any discrepancies between the evidence of the complainant and the respondent. So again, that's the other driver of cost. Now, strategies there, you always want to allow a fair bit of time for the complainant to tell his or her story, right? Part of this process of doing the investigation and what's helpful about it is you don't, not only do you get to the truth of the matter to figure out what happened, but it gives the complainant an opportunity to be heard. And maybe up until this point, they haven't been able to share their story, or they haven't been able to trust someone enough to tell that story. So this is the first time that they were able to explain, here's the horrible thing that allegedly happened to me in the workplace. And giving them the time to tell their story is very important. That's even more important when you're dealing with individuals who are victims of sexual assault and maybe suffering from trauma. That's allowing that person time to tell the story in their own words and in their own way is very much consistent with a trauma-informed approach to conducting investigations. But certainly, generally speaking, you could try to put time limits on the interviews themselves. So you might give yourself an allowance to say, look, we'd like to cap these interviews at 2 hours each. Or if it's an interview with a minor witness, you might say, look, we'd like to cap this interview at 45 minutes. And that at least gives you or the external investigator some guidelines to work within, and they can keep track of that time. And if they happen to go over that time limit for whatever reason, it then gives you the opportunity to have a discussion with the investigator to just find out, well, what happened during the interview? Why did it take longer than what we had budgeted for? And likely there's a reason for that, but it allows you to at least have that conversation with the investigator about that. So that's a strategy that you can employ to, again, manage the costs. And the third major driver of cost is the investigation report, right? Do you need a detailed report that summarizes all of the evidence and provides an analysis of the evidence and then the findings? Or are you looking for something that is more of a summary report that indicates here are the allegations, here are the conclusions based on the evidence that was collected, to basically have a document that records the fact that you conducted an investigation and gives you something in writing where you can get back to the parties to indicate what the conclusions were with respect to their allegations. So you have to use your judgment, right? Not, this isn't just about saving costs. This is also about looking at the investigation in the context of what else is going on. If there has been a sexual assault or a serious allegations of sexual harassment in the workplace, certainly as the employer, you're going to defer to a detailed report because the matter is likely to end up in litigation, whether that's in front of a human rights tribunal or at arbitration or in court. And in those circumstances, as the employer, you want to be able to say, we did a thorough investigation. We retained external legal counsel to conduct that investigation. Here's the process, here's the report. And we then made a decision based on that report, and those decisions that we made were reasonable. That's especially the case if you're dismissing someone based on that report. You certainly want to be able to have a document that's going to justify that decision. The fourth strategy I'd like to review with you is just the importance of investigating complaints promptly. I have had so many situations where I've been retained to investigate a complaint, but the incidents that gave rise to that complaint happened, more than a year ago, and that ultimately results in higher cost to you. It's going to result in more aggravation for the complainant because they believe that their complaint maybe wasn't taken seriously or it's not being taken seriously, and the employer isn't interested in doing anything about the situation. That may not be the case at all. There may be things happening in the background that the complainant isn't aware of. But when it takes multiple months or a year to come to the point where you're then retaining external counsel to conduct the investigation, that's not the ideal place where you want to be. The other thing is, when you have an individual complainant who's upset, then they're more likely to, while you're making plans to retain an investigator, they may get fed up and say, what, I'm just going to go to the human rights tribunal with this, or initiate some other process. And now you're managing essentially the same fact scenario, but in multiple different forums, right? So that adds to the cost. And then when it comes to the actual investigation, once you get started, then you're dealing with someone who it's going to take longer to conduct those interviews, right? Like they're already upset. They want to tell you all of the ways where all the times when the employer dropped the ball, and all of the times when they felt ignored by this employer. And then you get into the fact scenario itself, and it takes more time again to go back and have not just the complainant, but other folks piece together what happened 12 months ago at a team meeting and who said what, and having them search their emails to get to recover relevant emails or the actual invite for the meeting itself to kind of figure out what happened. All of that takes time, and as we all know, recollections fade over time. So investigating promptly is another key strategy to help save costs. Now, when it comes to investigating promptly or responding promptly, I want to give you some more details around that. One of the reasons why it may take a long time for an issue to be investigated, whether internally or externally, is because the employer doesn't have a reliable system for receiving complaints, right? There isn't a central place that employees know of to or that they understand, hey, when I have an issue, here's who I need to contact. Here's the website that I go to. Here's the email address that I go to. It's, really, especially in a large organization, it's them trying to navigate, this system on their own. And sometimes they're just not well equipped to do that. And so what I've seen is you have a complaint that is made to a supervisor, and maybe that frontline supervisor doesn't understand that this is a complaint because of how the story is told, right? Oftentimes people don't come to you and have something in writing and say, hey, I am making a formal complaint. That's more coming to you and relieving themselves of this burden. Hey, here's the thing that happened to me. I just want to get this off my chest, or I'm not comfortable with a certain situation that I just experienced, and they're talking through things. And so oftentimes you're leaving it up to that frontline manager to essentially screen for these complaints and figure out, is there problematic behavior here or not? And is this something that needs to be brought to the attention of HR? So I think having a clear system where and making and communicating that to managers as well as employees to say, look, you have a concern, here's where you will go. And that way you've got a team of people on the receiving end who can receive these concerns and then take the appropriate steps. That is going to help you to respond in a timely manner. Acknowledging the complaint, that's a key part of this too. Oftentimes people employees will file a complaint, but then not hear anything. So they don't know if HR is working on it. Did they receive it? Do they have any questions? Oftentimes it's just silence, while again, there's things happening in the background, but the employee is not aware of what those things are. And that leads to frustration. And then taking steps to initiate a fact finding. If you're strapped for resources in-house, then moving more quickly to bring in an external investigator is helpful. But sometimes the file sits internally as you try to figure out, maybe you're waiting to meet with the parties, maybe there's a union rep involved and you're waiting to meet with them. But sometimes you get stuck in these internal processes, and you're waiting for maybe someone internally to be freed up to do this, and that doesn't happen, right? But that just leads to further delay and further aggravation. So that's another key point where you can identify that and adjust your systems so that you're able to respond in a more timely manner. And then finally, the last strategy that I wanted to review with you is just about the budget. When you have mapped out the investigation and when you are clear on your mandate and you have identified the folks that you need to meet with and the type of report that you have, then what you can do is map out the time that's likely to be spent at each of those stages and come up with a budget. And that goes for if you're doing this internally or if you're working with an external investigator. Certainly you can use this as a starting point to have a discussion with an external investigator in terms of what's a reasonable budget for this work. And an experienced investigator should be able to tell you, once they have the necessary facts, they should be able to give you a fairly accurate quote for that. At our firm, we've actually moved to a fixed fee approach. So we certainly offer the hourly rate for investigations, but for clients as well, once we have the fact pattern, we'll also quote a fixed fee, and that way the client can decide which way, which method works better for them, and many just prefer the peace of mind of a fixed fee, and then the onus is on the investigator to stay within that budget, and then that budget really only changes if there's an expansion of the mandate or something extraordinary happens outside of what the parties understood and had agreed to on the front end. But certainly having an investigation plan and understanding the drivers of cost, that's going to help you have that discussion with the investigator and then negotiate a better retainer with that person. So that covers the strategies in terms of how you can save money when conducting a workplace investigation. I would like to now turn it over to Melanie, and hopefully we have some questions there for to review.
Thank you so much, Dorian. That was wonderful. We have a couple of questions coming in. The first one is, if an interview is going longer than planned, do you recommend a second part? And a part of that is, when would an investigator want to keep going over their time versus breaking it up into multiple interviews?
So in terms of the interview itself, the primary consideration when you're conducting an interview is getting the information that you need from a party or from the witness. And we can look at this in two parts, the strategy for working with a complainant, and then the strategy for when you're dealing with a witness. But when it comes to the complainant, those interviews are extremely important. As I said, there's a whole context, right? That person has experienced there's a whole history before their complaint, right? They have the alleged incidents that they experienced, where they have their experience with management or HR in terms of bringing this concern forward, and then whatever the experience is, waiting for an investigator to be assigned to the file. So in that context, you have to appreciate the anxiety and the stress that person is feeling coming forward, and you want to be empathetic, especially as an investigator in that circumstance. You do not want to be looking at your watch when they're telling their story. You do not want to cut that person off just because you're at the 2-hour mark. You want to hear their story, and that's what's paramount, is letting that person tell their story in their own way. Now, if you've made an agreement, with the client to say, we're going to try to keep these interviews to 2 hours, and the person that you're speaking with is going off on a tangent and really rambling and not really telling their story in a coherent way, it's something that you're taking notes. You're making note of this, but you're not cutting the person off, right? Because again, your goal here as the investigator is to hear their story, and especially for someone who's been through a lot of trauma, letting them tell the story in their own words in whatever order makes sense to them. So you're essentially just like, you're letting the clock run. You're not interrupting them, but you are being cognizant of the time. And more, what you want to be concerned about, especially with the complainant, is that it is really fatigue. You don't want to have somebody sitting there for 4 hours, because that's exhausting. So it's really a judgment call. Certainly you want to offer them to take a break at a certain point in time, and have a lunch break, take comfort breaks, and let them know that you can keep going, or you can or we can reschedule for another day. And certainly I've broken up interviews over a couple of days, just because there's one case I had in the university context where there was 10 complainants who had filed complaints against a professor, and in that context, there was no way that we were going to make the responding party sit there for 10 hours to answer all these answer to all of these allegations. So it just made sense, right? Some cases, from the get-go, you're going to have to split this interview over a couple of days to get through it. I've had cases where I've offered to do that for a party, and they didn't want to do that. They just preferred to sit down and plow through, because that was easier for them than going home and knowing that they had to come back and answer these questions again tomorrow. So I've certainly had people who preferred to just plow through and get through the interview. So the main consideration for the investigator is getting the evidence that they need, and being empathetic, and offering breaks, and employing those strategies to get through it in a manageable way, right? And I would say my typical again, this is just anecdotal. Looking back over my investigations, usually at the 3-hour mark, if it's taking longer than that, like that's where I take a look at what information we still have to cover, what ground we have covered, and then usually we take a break and I have a discussion with the witness about whether or not we should meet another day, or how they're telling their story. Again, in a case where we're not employing a trauma-informed approach, right, and where we can be a little bit more assertive with the witness, we have a conversation about the details or extra details that he or she is providing, and try to get see if they can stay on track and get through the remaining allegations. But you interview all kinds of individuals, right, when you do this work, and there are some folks where you end up taking 3 interviews to get through information, where had they been a little bit more focused, you could have gotten that information in one interview or in one sitting. So you have to be flexible as an investigator, and respond to the circumstances. So I'd say you want to be very sensitive, again, when we're dealing with a complainant. When you're dealing with a witness, you have a little bit more latitude, right? So because witnesses, those are very focused interviews, right? With the complainant, you're asking this person to tell their story, and you're trying to understand and their experience. With the witness, they're not there to tell their story. The witness is there to help you resolve a specific question. You've heard from the complainant, you have heard from the responding party. There's a conflict in the evidence, and this witness may have seen something or heard something, or been part of a broader interaction, and you're basically narrowing down to that single piece of evidence with them. So you can be much more pointed. You don't have to listen to them or spend any length of time listening to them. If they're going off on a tangent, you can bring them and refocus them and try to get at the evidence that you need. So I would say you get better at doing this with time and with experience. But the takeaway here is that the way that you manage a complainant is different from the way that you would manage a witness when it comes to limiting them and the time that you spend with them during an interview.
Thank you, Dorian. We've got 2 more questions here. Next one from Marie Claire. Sometimes the investigation starts late because the complainant came forward at that time. Any strategies to address the situation?
That's a very good question. A lot of people, for various reasons, they do experience things, and they hold on to them and endure them, and then finally come forward. And I would say in those situations, especially where you see that happening more than once, I would go back and look at if there's something systemic in the workplace. Is there a reason why people don't feel safe coming forward? And that would be the question that I would ask myself is, do employees feel safe coming forward with their complaints? And if not, why not? And that would be a step that I would take, is taking a sample of employees, doing an assessment of the workplace or that branch or wherever the issue seems to be more persistent, and asking those questions. So just being proactive, right, and doing that assessment, understanding what the dynamic is there, and then taking steps to respond to whatever your findings are. So maybe folks don't feel safe coming forward because there is an influential person in management, and maybe they're discouraging their complaints, or maybe they I've had cases where you have a senior person who is saying who is known to be very close to HR, and they talk all the time about how they're socializing with HR, and they're very close to HR, and so that employee they don't threaten the employees at all, but the fact that everybody knows that they're so close to HR, what employees assume is that I'm not going to get a fair shake from HR because HR is best friends with this guy, and this guy is he's a source of frustration and aggravation in this workplace. So there's essentially nowhere to go. So those are, there's a lot of different reasons why folks might hold on to issues or endure things and then wait for it to reach a breaking point before they come forward. And I would just try to be proactive and ask those questions and try to assess the culture and whether or not individuals do feel safe coming forward, and if not, why not?
Thank you, Dorian. And the last question we have here is with respect to mandate, if during the course of the investigation, a witness brings up related information that would itself constitute a misconduct by that respondent, is it best to expand that mandate to include both or to keep them as separate investigations?
So you have to take the information and then assess that in the context of what you already have. Sometimes the allegation is, as Marie-Claire, as you indicated, it supports on its face its problematic behavior. Is it grounded in the same fact scenario that the investigator is looking into? Is it like how closely is it tied into the facts that the investigator is looking at? I would think, again, in my experience, in most cases, it makes sense to expand the mandate of the investigator to look into it, but not always. Sometimes, if I go back to the example I gave at the beginning, I was involved in a harassment complaint, and then the allegation comes out that this general manager is having an affair with the responding party, or was having an affair with the responding party. That on its face is obviously misconduct, and it is related to the extent that it created this culture in the workplace, or created discomfort and discouraged at least this one individual from coming forward. It was awkward for everyone who knew about the relationship, and I would say that was one that was on the fence, because I didn't need to investigate the affair in order to figure out what happened between the complainant and the respondent. So, but the fact that I was there and I had interviewed these folks already and had collected some information and knew the background, those things would have created an efficiency where I then, if you bring in another investigator, that person has to get to know the parties again, right? And understand the workplace dynamic, and then get into the allegations themselves. So there certainly would have been efficiencies if the client had retained me to look into that issue, but it was discreet enough where they could have kept it separate and investigated it internally or via somebody else. So, yeah, I think you look at are there efficiencies there, and then discuss it with the investigator and see what makes sense in the circumstance.
Thank you, Dorian. Those were the questions we had today.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for participating this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you and receive your questions. We have another webinar planned for next month, and those notifications will be coming out shortly. Also, if there's a topic that you would like us to unpack for you, if you're dealing with an issue in one of your own investigations, or there's something that you just want to get a better understanding of, please don't hesitate to send me an email or connect with me on LinkedIn and let us know, and we'd be happy to put together a future webinar on that topic. So thanks very much, and look forward to seeing you all back here again next month. Take care, everyone.